Welcome back to Life After Prison. This is the second episode in our 4-part mini-series where we're looking at the role of rehabilitation within the prison system. For this series, we wanted to go beyond lived experience and also speak to people working inside the system.
So for these episodes, I went and spoke to a few experts who work in and around prisons to hear their perspective on rehabilitation. So what helps, what gets in the way, and what could be done better.
Yeah, we've already heard from Roland Carthouse, who is an architect, all about prison design. But today we're looking at rehabilitation from a different angle. We're looking at daily life inside, neurodiversity, and what kind of support people need post-release.
To explore that, I spoke to Occupational Therapist Jenny Okolo. She works with people in prisons and in the community. Her focus is on how daily routines, purposeful activities, and understanding neurodiversity can all play a role in rehabilitation.
Yeah, Jules, Jenny's job role and description sounds like something that should obviously be implemented to support someone in becoming a better version of themselves, especially in the prison, right? So I wouldn't have necessarily connected like this job description to an occupational therapist, if I'm honest, which is very surprising. So I'm really excited to find out what she has to say.
I feel like most people we speak to haven't had the support either that they need or that they know they need inside, but obviously on release as well. So we're all always asking the question, because this seems like a high priority, having something that they're good at, somebody's good at, and actually get out and be able to perform that skill, use that skill. So yeah, I'm really excited to get into the conversation too. And I'm a big believer about being like doing what you love and like actually being able to do that on the outside. I think it's super important.
Big facts.
So I asked Jenny, what does daily life inside do to someone's sense of self? How can activity and structure help people rebuild? And what needs to change if rehabilitation is really the goal? Because also, this is how I felt, and people that we speak to, that, prison is a waste of time. Obviously, there is things that you can do in there, and not everything is a waste of time. And we used our time quite wisely, not all the time, because it's really hard. But also the jobs in there, what do we really want to do those jobs? Are we really having fun doing those jobs? And is that really what we want to do when we get out?
True.
That's super important, right?
True. So throughout this episode, you're going to hear some voices that you may recognize. For example, Kenny Mafferdon talking about putting the work in before you come out. Jacob Dunn on the prison regime. Tony Supreme on the importance of creative practice. And Darren Murinas talking about the value of lived experience input. All are past Life After Prison guests sharing their experiences of life inside. If you'd like to hear their full stories, make sure you check out their episodes.
All right, let's get into it. Introduce who you are and what you do for everybody listening.
Okay, so my name is Jenny Okolo. I am a occupational therapist, and I've worked in various places, but mainly within the mental health sector. That's from community to hospital to prison. And now I'm sort of like everywhere at the moment in my current role as a clinical commissioner. I also run my own clinical practice called SASA Health and Sensory, where we do private assessments, mainly from a sensory perspective, but we also do consultations and workshops for corporations and charities as well.
So for people listening that might not know what an occupational therapist does, can you explain that for us, and especially in a prison setting?
Yes. So occupational therapy, sometimes it's quite difficult to explain just because depending on the setting you're in, it could mean something different. But I suppose at the heart of it is we support people with their independence and with getting back to doing the things that they once did or that's meaningful to them. So in a prison setting, we as occupational therapists would work mainly with people who maybe have mental health conditions or have been in prison for a long time and maybe have lost some of the skills that they once had or never even got a chance to learn them. And that looks like supporting them with having a routine, with money management, even with sort of social type of work as well. And all of this is to sort of prepare them for reintegration back into society. So we do a lot of skill-based work. We work alongside other professionals as well. So, usually as part of the MDT, which is the multidisciplinary team, you've got doctors, your nurses, and, from our side, our sort of approach is a bit more creative in a sense of our type of therapy isn't always just one-to-one talking because the person might not be ready for that. So we try and take a more creative approach by maybe interacting with them through cooking, for example. And of course, that sounds fun, but as they're cooking, we are looking at the different areas within their skills, like are they able to follow instruction? Are they able to utilize the equipment in a safe manner? So an occupational therapist, you can work in various settings.
Are occupational therapists based in prisons as a rule? Are they there, or is it kind of maybe some prisons or at some times?
So it's not as a rule. So most occupational therapists, actually, I'd say probably all, are employed via the NHS. So of course, like the NHS is completely separate from the prison service. So we are employed from them and we essentially go into the prisons to carry out a service. And we're usually part of a small team. I would say probably the mental health service and health service in general, they tend to be quite small in comparison to the amount of prisoners that there are. So the ratio is always very off. So yeah, we tend to be outsourced. There's a lot of outsourcing you'll find in the prison system, whether that's clinicians or other types of therapies as well that they sort of bring into the prison.
And a lot of the work has to start from within. And we talk to a lot of them. Before we engage with them, they feel like, oh yeah, when I get out, it's going to start. And it has to start from your cell.
Yep.
That's when it has to start. You have to change your heart and mind. You've got to do the character work, doing stuff whilst you're in your cell, not when you get out. Trust me, the temptation and the challenge, you don't even know what you're walking into. Trust me.
Having said that, I remember there's a time when I ended up going back to the same prison I was in before. Yeah. So I got released, boom, boom, ended up coming back. And it was actually in Friday Juma service. One of the senior brothers was like, bruv, what are you doing back? Like, what are you doing here? You get me? And I was like, listen, unks, real talk, I wasn't prepared. Like, outside the world hits you, da-da-da-da. Cut a long story short, a few years later, he got parole and got released. And then he messaged me like, bro, I fully understand what you were saying. Like, I fully get it. I was not ready. But you having that conversation with me opened my eyes. You know what I'm saying? So it's facts, you got to do the work inside, or unfortunately, like myself, you end up repeating the same mistakes or going back there. So that's real talk.
You've spoken before about how important responsibilities can be for a prisoner. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yes, I think it's super important because I think, first of all, if you think about what, for those listening, if you haven't been in the prison, you probably get an idea of what it's like just from, I guess, what you've seen on the media and things like that. It can be quite restrictive. And that's from the amount of hours prisoners meant to stay in their cell and just the lack of, I guess, freedom to do the things that you would probably do prior to prison. So as an occupational therapist, I would work very closely with prisoners and just people to, I guess, start building that routine. And responsibility can show up in different ways, right? And like I said at the start about being creative, when I first came in, I might have been a little bit hopeful in a sense of all the amazing things I could do, but I quickly had to realize that I had to be even more creative. So what I would usually do in a clinical setting, like on the ward, for example, I may not be able to do whilst being on the wings. So an example of sort of instilling that responsibility, I remember I was working with this one young person trying to sort of instill that responsibility, and we gave him a plant. We gave him a plant to take care of in his cell. And I suppose initially it sort of looked like, oh gosh, what am I going to do with this? And that was the exact response as well. But I just said to him, listen, just take care of this. It was cleared by the governors and everything. They said it was fine for him to have that in the cell. And over time, I'd continue asking him about it and I'll continue checking in. And sooner, or later, the plant actually started growing. And you could see the pride every time I walked onto that wing. He'd be like, oh, miss, come and have a look at the plant. Look how big it's grown. And just that sense of pride, knowing that he's been able to take care of this one plant, was a massive indicator of just the possibilities of what he could do once he's out in the community. And that's just one example. Of course, there's like, depending on what prison you're at as well, there's other roles within the work or even within education that people can be involved in. But I think it's important to help them hold on to a bit of hope as well, but also start instilling some of those skills. And you have to start off small, especially as, like I said, it can be quite restrictive and some people are in there for a long time as well. So I think it's really important to instill that responsibility. And it's also, I suppose, in a way, moving slightly away from a more punitive way of looking at things and maybe looking more towards the rehabilitation side of things as well. So from the rehab side, as an OT, as a health professional, that would be one of the first things that we would look at in terms of, what are some things that you can take care of and showing that you are able to be responsible of something.
And you touched on regime there as well. How would you say that affects people inside prison and even getting out?
I mean, like I said, I came from sort of a clinical setting, and going into the prison, they have a certain way of doing things. There are certain times to let people out and there's certain times for the cell doors to be sort of locked away. So the regime can be quite strict and there is often little room for flexibility as well, just because it's pre-planned ahead of time as well. And I found that the regime really impacted a lot of people's mental health, and especially if they were first timers, and so first time in prison, and they had no clue of how they could sort of manage. And a lot of the referrals that I got to occupational therapy, they would state that they were struggling to adapt to the regime. That was literally the sentence that I would get most of the time. So a lot of the time it was me sort of speaking to the people and just trying to get them to understand what the regime's about and see if there's ways that we could perhaps adapt it in their own way. So for example, you're staying in your cell majority of the day. What can you do in there? What can we provide? We used to give out a lot of activity packs. And granted, it's probably not the most exciting thing, but it's just something to do and to start off with. And I find that the regime, especially for those who have neurodevelopmental conditions like autism or even ADHD, that's even harder on them because they're having to adjust to yet another sort of routine. And especially if you're not good with changes and things like that, that could be quite difficult for you. So I found there were a lot of people in distress purely because of the regime and because they weren't able to adapt.
And then in terms of regime, the problem with the regime is like strips you of all your responsibility. And what we're trying to do is get people to take responsibility.
I hear you.
So if you were telling people when to wake up, giving them a limited option of food, telling them when to go to bed, taking all their choices away from them,
or minimizing
their choices, then it's not very helpful in terms of making people be more responsible and functioning in being able to cope in when they reintegrate back into the community. And then just in terms of screening for these problems and diagnosing these problems, whether it's mental health issues, whether it's speech and language learning difficulties, whether it's neurodivergence, whether it's trauma and adverse childhood experiences, all of these issues that predate people getting into prison, but the environments aren't really there to treat those things, never mind pick them up and diagnose them. And then people are violent and they express themselves through violence. So you're on edge all the time. So what I change is I try and change the regime to make people more responsible. I try and incorporate ways in which you make the prison more relational that encourages people to have better relationships in prison between staff and prisoners. I'd have a more purposeful regime that gives people a bit more kind of purposeful activity and doing stuff that they kind of learning new skills, learning more about themselves.
That's a lot to change.
That's a lot to change.
Basically the opposite of what's happening.
Basically the opposite.
I agree with all of that,
Education needs to be a little bit different, but the problem is that, you got to change people's aspirations and attitudes in order for them to even engage, because you can lead the horse to water, but, you can't make them drink.
Force it to drink.
With the work that you do, how does that affect people's identity and them as a person? What have you seen change in people when they have this kind of help?
That's a good question. So I suppose I'm looking back at so I'll create like a program for the prison and would have like different groups. I would have like a cooking group. We used to have a yoga teacher come in as well. So again, that was outsourced from outside. And I could immediately see, so when I was working at the prison, I was the occupational therapy lead and also the day center manager as well. So the day center was sort of, I guess it's still within the prison, but sort of a separate side where people could do activities. Anyways, having all these activities in place and I guess some sort of routine for a lot of the prisoners to go to, I could immediately see the demand, first of all, because they all wanted to come out of their cells.
I'm not surprised.
And, it was also the fact that this program was made in conjunction with them. So I'd asked them, what is it that you would like? Obviously, we have to be realistic in terms of what we can facilitate. But I remember I'd bring around a list of things that we could do, the types of group, and I would ask, tell me, what's the consensus here? Do you want to do music therapy? Do you want to do the, I used to call it creative space, where they, get all the art materials and things like that. So seeing people come upstairs to the day center and seeing them come regularly as well, seeing the same faces, you could already see the change in demeanor compared to when they first came, because at first it can be quite daunting, I suppose, to the point where even when I would go onto the wings, I would have other people who weren't on my caseload asking about it because word had spread so much about the program that was available. And I suppose that's the sad thing, is that I knew that I could not cater to everyone. I knew this program couldn't, because there were thousands of people that would have loved to come, and that's perhaps due to the lack of funding and staff, understaffing and things like that. But having that routine and having something that was a consistent, which for the most part, depending on their backgrounds and looking at trauma and where people have come from, a lot of them haven't had that consistency in their lives. So having something consistent in terms of, here's the program, and every single week, every Monday, every Tuesday, this will be made available, I think was quite positive to their mental health. And even in terms of behavior-wise, you could see the reduction in incidences in some of them too.
And then we also do painting or some sort of like creative practice. So it might be creative writing, poetry or painting. And that just it creates a really open space and a safe space to kind of express those emotions through, whether it's painting, it's like colors, or, we've had some really interesting paintings where the guys are like, I just feel dark. Like all I feel is darkness. And I'm like, paint that. Like, what is that? And then the conversation is like, how do we now feel once we've got those emotions on the canvas, right? And during the painting, we're having conversations about trauma, grief, the impact of violence on ourselves, whether we're perpetrators or victims of it, often interchangeable, And so, that's usually what the sessions are.
What's the kind of response that you get?
It's interesting. It's a good response. Firstly, I'll say it's good. I think the thing I've learned actually being in the prisons and like working in some of the young offender institutions, people are a lot more open to the conversation around wellness, because I think it's recognized that it's needed, but it's like without support, we don't know how to get there. So I think a lot of the young men, the idea of like closing your eyes in a room full of other men in a place like a prison, which can feel really unsafe, where you feel like you need to have your wits about you, seeing people close their eyes for 5 minutes when some of the teachers in those prisons are like, they won't even sit still for 2 minutes. Do you know what I mean? Or, they're going to come into the session and they're going to do what they want, but try your best. And it's like, okay, like I've been here before.
But there's a difference. And the reason I asked that question, what the response is, because there's a big difference when you walk into a room and someone can relate to you straight away. Yeah. So that makes a big difference. But also it's really important work, because we don't have these spaces traditionally growing up or in society where as Black men, we can actually speak about what is trauma to us. Why do we feel the type of way we feel? What is it about society that makes us feel this way, and reflect on it, and why we respond this way with our actions? So when the teacher's saying, 2 minutes, you don't understand the bigger picture.
Yeah.
How do prisons currently recognise and support neurodiverse individuals?
So at the moment, there's been a lot of research and emphasis put on neurodiversity within prisons. So even if you, I suppose, were to Google it now, you'll see that a lot of prisons have sort of dedicated specific wings, for example, for those who are neurodiverse, and really invested in training. I think that that's amazing. But the reality is this is still a prison. So some of the, I guess, traits of being neurodiverse, and obviously there's a massive spectrum, but for example, somebody who is very sensitive to noise and maybe communication isn't, they've got specific communication styles, that does require a lot of effort. And sometimes it also requires a lot of specialist interventions. So I think it's great that we're heading into that direction of recognizing the massive gap. Also recognizing that there are so many people in prison who have been living undiagnosed for such a long time. And because of that, sometimes some of the behavioral, I guess, side of things have been mislabeled or misdiagnosed as something else. And I saw a lot of that.
And how important is it for that person when they do receive the right support and help, especially in an environment like prison?
Oh, it's super important. And it's important because of the quality of life that person deserves. I think it's important for them to get the tailored support as well, because it's not a one size fits all. And that's probably one of the things that, we're still working towards, because you often hear about neurodiversity this, autism this, ADHD this, but it's a massive umbrella. There's other conditions as well. There's people who may have sensory issues too. So it's more about educating them. And when I say them, it's everybody who's involved.
We've spoken previously about officers and people working inside prisons about being trauma informed and, how important that really is, because we are dealing with human people. Just going back to maybe what somebody that's neurodiverse, the challenges they may face that is overlooked. We've spoken about noise. Can you just explain maybe some more?
Yeah. Obviously, noise is a massive factor. It can be very loud in prison. Even just being in such a contained space as well can be very overwhelming. I touched on communication. So that is probably one of the biggest ones as well, how to communicate with somebody who is neurodiverse.
And with training for staff and people that, have daily communication with these kind of people, what better training do you think needs to be put in place? What does that look like?
What that looks like, I think definitely having someone externally come in to speak to people. I think I really advocate for having people with lived experience to deliver training. Honestly, but and I say this, but not to say that people who are specialists in that area, they can't do it justice. That's fine. But there is something about having someone come in to tell you their lived experience and telling you from their perspective as well. Because as much as we, want to do good and we want to learn and we want to try and implement this, there's certain things that somebody with lived experience can tell us that the other person won't. And also it's part of including people in this whole program and approach that we're trying to make in terms of being more trauma approach and also being more client-centered as well. So why not bring them along if those are the people that we're going to be talking about and those are the people we're trying to help? So I really do believe in a collaborative approach.
And it also helps, it really educate and inform the systems that the lived experiences gained from in order to improve them, right?
Mm.
Yeah, and most definitely. We also say, we don't hold all the answers, but by working together, we can go out and find them answers together and really start making them improvements that we need.
100%. What's it been like, the response from these organizations in terms of accepting that lived experience, knowledge and insight?
When we first started a number of years ago now, it was quite difficult to get the seat round the table, to get our voices heard. But with persistence, we're persistent people, things are improving now. We're not just that sort of tick box exercise. People are recognising us that we have knowledge, we have wisdom, we have skills, and we have the right to be in them conversations. Yeah. So things are moving on, and we'll keep doing what we're doing till we, make the world a better place, shall we say.
With your role as an occupational therapist, what kind of support is in place for people when they're leaving prison?
So our role can vary into different areas, but I can mention a few. One, we work very closely with housing in the community. So, for example, supported living, that's maybe specifically catered to those with forensic history, but also maybe a mental health background as well. So occupational therapists would help in doing certain assessments to be able to identify what type of placement is suitable for them. We also look at employability, so vocational type of support. What's the person going to be doing when they're out in the community? How will they occupy their time? They've just maybe come from having some sort of routine in prison. Let's carry that on and let's build on that. They also work very closely with care coordinators. So some prisoners might have one, some might not, but care coordinators are usually part of community mental health teams, and they oversee their entire care once they're in the community. So there's a lot of liaison in terms of making sure that they're working on certain skills, like I mentioned before, cooking skills, being able to budget if that's something, an area that they need to focus on. So that tends to be the type of work that an OT does. And of course, there's more to that as well. And yeah, I think it's really important for not just OTs, but just that general MDT approach to continue after prison, because I think, yes, there are other factors, but I think one major factor of reoffending is not having that structure available. And it's not done intentionally, but because there are a lot of pressures in the community, some people can slip through the net and they commit the crime, they come back into prison, they start again. So I think it's really important to continue that support from prison and just making sure that people are as supported as they were in prison, for example, outside as well, and just making sure that they're able to live functional lives.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for joining me in the studio. It's been just such a pleasure to have you, and so insightful and just really positive energy of what I actually believe is going to help people inside and moving forward. And it's just really lovely for you to be able to share all of that with everyone listening.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I hope people get to understand just the amazing work that is being done, but also, yeah, what more we can do. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me. So that was my conversation with occupational therapist Jenny Okolo. It was really powerful hearing how things like structure, meaningful activity can make such a difference to someone's sense of identity, especially in a prison environment where so much feels out of your control.
Yeah, and for me listening to it, it raised the point that if rehabilitation is the goal, then daily life has to be about more than just doing time, quote unquote. It has to actually help people build the skills and the confidence for life after release.
Yeah, also, I think for me, it's what the lack of responsibility can do to somebody, like feeling inadequate or not having the confidence. Like when you don't have a task that you're proud of, or you don't have a job role that at the end of it, you're like, I'm proud of that. Or you don't feel like you've got any skills and you don't really have the confidence. So I feel like being able to give somebody that or allow somebody to feel that in prison is crucial. Also, when Jacob said in his episode, you know, we're trying to get people to take responsibility of their actions and what they do. But then when you go to prison, you're taking that away.
Yeah, it's bang on. I think that's a fair point to make.
Yeah, I loved that.
I was also really surprised when Jenny mentioned giving someone a plant and how that responsibility can shift someone's mindset. Because I remember she was like, oh yeah, here's a plant. And they're like, oh, you giving me a plant for? Kind of thing. Like, and then coming back to them later down the line, and they're like, miss, look at the plant. Look how much it's grown. Like, so that shows that they've nurtured it, they've watered it, they've looked after it. You know what I'm saying? And how much that can change someone's mindset. Something so small or insignificant as a plant, what that can be done, used as a tool and what it can do. I think that's out of the box thinking. It's something we need.
And just to say, if you're listening and wondering how you or someone you know could get support from an occupational therapist inside, it's not something that's available everywhere. But Jenny told me that OTs are usually part of the healthcare team in prison. So if you think it could help, the first step is to speak to healthcare wherever you are.
Yeah, you know, also I'd like to add to that, and this is a bit of personal advice from me, is that having a routine, pushing yourself, whether that's learning new things, new skills, reading books, setting goals in the gym or with your fitness, or with educational courses. I knew a guy that said, I'm going to make sure I do every course. And he went from course to course to course. You know what I'm saying? So those kind of things are really good, not to be stagnant and stay in the same kind of person that you were when you come in.
Yeah, I feel like if there's one thing we both definitely learned from prison, it's we have to be proactive in there. And you really, really do. But if you are, you can get things that you need and want and skills that you deserve.
Yeah, and just to say, you know, we did mention, or we have spoken about neurodiversity, and what we've come to understand is that there's a high overrepresentation in prisons, with 50% of people inside self-reporting as neurodivergent, and that comes from the Bromley briefings. So it just goes to show that if there's that much of neurodivergence in prison, it really needs to be supported, and people need to be looked after and catered for.
We need the help, right?
Definitely do. So in this episode, you heard extracts from our conversations with Kenny Imafidon, Jacob Dunn, Tony Supreme, Darren Marinas. And if you want to hear their full stories, you can find these episodes on Life After Prison, wherever you get your podcasts. We'll also put links in the description. Yeah, so speaking of our past guests, we did speak to Darren a while back, and I think that was a couple of years ago. But nevertheless, what he said then is still relevant now, and how much people with lived experience can shape and improve the services from both sides, so both with staff, the service provider, and the people, you know, that are using it, the service user, but also about using that voice in rooms with the sense of belonging in them spaces. Like, some people may not have the confidence, but because you've been inside doesn't mean your opinion's any less irrelevant. Furthermore, it's even more relevant, especially when we're talking about how to improve things for people like us.
Yeah, I mean, when you just said there that this information is still relevant now, it just makes me think, we have recorded so many episodes now, and we've had so many incredible guests come on, and they were quite a while ago. So I just want to encourage people to listen to those conversations from even a couple years ago. They are incredible and fascinating people with fascinating stories, and so much to discover and learn.
Big facts.
So that was another episode in our mini-series on rehabilitation and the prison system. Like we've said before, this isn't the full picture, but these conversations give us, and hopefully you guys, a chance to hear some different perspectives.
Yeah, we'll leave the links in the description to organisations you can reach out to if you've been affected by anything that we've spoken about today, or if you want to find out more information about support and reform.
Thank you so much for listening, and join us next time when you'll be hearing my conversation with Dr. Graham Durkin about mental health in prisons and what that means for rehabilitation.
Yeah, so we'll see you then.